In the final, desperate months of 1944, the world was a theater of fire and steel. The Allied forces were closing in on Berlin from every direction. The sky belonged to the British Spitfire and the American Mustang. To any rational military observer, the era of German aviation was dead. But inside a secret, nondescript hangar in Göttingen, the laws of the 20th century were being quietly discarded. When Allied intelligence teams finally crossed the threshold of that facility, they didn't find a broken air force, they found a nightmare from the future. Sitting on the hangar floor was a machine that defied every visual cue of 1940s engineering. It had no tail to provide stability. It had no fuselage to house a pilot. It was a jagged, bat-like triangle of dark wood and steel, the Horten Ho 229. This was the ghost plane, a weapon so fundamentally broken in its favor that if it had reached the front lines just months earlier, the Allied victory wouldn't have just been delayed, it would have been rendered impossible. To understand why this plane was a glitch in the matrix of war, you have to understand the obsession of two brothers, Reimar and Walter Horten. They weren't traditional military engineers, they were rebels. Since the early 1930s, the Hortens had been fixated on a singular, radical idea, the all-wing design. In traditional aviation, every part of a plane that isn't the wing, the tail, the rudder, the body, is essentially parasitic drag. These parts create weight and air resistance, slowing the plane down and forcing it to burn more fuel. The Hortens realized that if you could build a plane that was only a wing, you would create the most efficient flying machine in human history. But there was a reason no one else did it. Without a tail, a plane is inherently unstable. It wants to flip, spin, and tumble out of the sky. The Hortens solved this through a mechanical exploit known as bell-shaped lift distribution. By twisting the wing in a specific geometric pattern, they forced the air to stabilize the craft without the need for a tail. They had found a loophole in the laws of physics that allowed for a pure, lethal shape. By 1943, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, was desperate. He issued the 3x1000 mandate. Germany needed a plane that could carry a 1,000-kilogram bomb at 1,000 kilometers per hour for a distance of 1,000 kilometers. Every major German aviation firm said it was impossible. The jet engines of the time were too thirsty for fuel, and the airframes were too heavy. The Horten brothers walked into the room and offered the Horten Ho 229. Because their flying wing had zero parasitic drag, it was the only design on Earth that could meet Göring's impossible goal. It was faster than any Allied fighter, could fly higher than any anti-aircraft gun could reach, and carried a payload that could level city blocks. But as they began construction, they accidentally discovered something even more terrifying than speed: invisibility. In 1944, the British chain-home radar was the most advanced early warning system on the planet. It sent out massive radio waves to detect incoming metal bombers, but the Horten Ho 229 was a ghost. Because it lacked the vertical surfaces of a tail and a fuselage, it had a drastically reduced radar cross-section. The radio waves didn't bounce back to the British receivers, they were scattered into the atmosphere. But the glitch went deeper. Due to a shortage of aluminum, the Hortens built the Ho 229 primarily out of wood, specifically plywood layers bonded with a special resin. Modern chemical analysis of the surviving prototype suggests they infused the glue with charcoal dust. This wasn't for strength. Charcoal is carbon-rich and conductive. By layering charcoal between the wood, the Hortens had created the world's first radar-absorbent material, or RAM. They had unintentionally designed a plane that was functionally invisible to the most advanced technology of the era. When the Americans captured the Ho 229 during Operation Paperclip, they were so baffled by its design that they shipped it directly to the Smithsonian. For 50 years, it sat in a crate, dismissed as a Nazi pipe dream. That was until the late 1980s, when the United States unveiled the B-2 stealth bomber. The world gasped at the B-2's alien, tailless shape, but the engineers at Northrop Grumman weren't looking at the future. They were looking at the Horten blueprints from 1944.
When Northrop engineers built a full-scale replica of the HO-229 in 2008 to test it against radar, the results were chilling. The 1944 Ghost plane reduced the detection range of Allied radar by 20 to 40%. It would have given British pilots only 8 minutes to react before the bombs hit London. The HO-229 wasn't just a plane, it was an anomaly that arrived half a century too early. It was the illegal glitch of the World War II battlefield, a weapon that proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can encounter isn't a better version of what you have, it's something from a future you're not prepared for.
In the history of warfare, there is a concept known as the first look. It dictates that the side that sees the enemy first wins. In 1944, the British military believed they had achieved the first look forever. Their chain-home radar system was a ring of steel made of radio waves. It was the reason the Luftwaffe failed to crush England during the Blitz. Every German bomber was a massive metal target that screamed its location to British receivers hundreds of miles away. But the Horten H229 was a glitch in that system. It didn't just fly through the radar, it deleted itself from the screen. This wasn't magic, it was the result of a desperate, forbidden engineering exploit that wouldn't be fully understood for another 60 years. While the rest of the world's aerospace engineers were fighting over aluminum supplies, the Horten brothers were working with wood. To the uninitiated, building a jet fighter out of wood in 1944 seemed like a sign of German collapse, but it was actually a masterstroke of accidental stealth. Aluminum is a conductor. It reflects radio waves back to a radar dish like a mirror reflects light. Wood, however, is a dielectric. It allows radio waves to pass through it or scatters them. But Horten Raymar knew that wood alone wasn't enough. He needed to ensure that even the internal metal components, the massive Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines, and the steel frame were hidden. This led to the discovery of the charcoal glue exploit. Raymar began experimenting with a mixture of sawdust, charcoal dust, and specialized resins. This wasn't just glue, it was the world's first radar-absorbent material, RAM. The carbon in the charcoal acted as a sponge for electromagnetic energy. When the British radar hit the H229, they didn't bounce back. Instead, the carbon particles in the skin turned that radio energy into tiny amounts of heat. The plane was literally eating the radar. In an era where the word stealth didn't even exist in the military dictionary, the Horten brothers had built a plane that utilized the same carbon-based principles used today in the F-117 Nighthawk and the F-35. The second half of the exploit was purely geometric. Radar detection is based on corner reflectors. When a radio wave hits a 90-degree angle, like the spot where a tail meets a fuselage, it bounces back with massive intensity. Every plane in 1944 was a collection of 90-degree angles. The H229 had 0. By creating a flying wing, the Hortens removed the most visible part of an airplane. The smooth, blended curves of the H229 meant that the few radar waves that weren't absorbed by the charcoal skin were deflected away into space, never returning to the British receivers. It was a low observable shape discovered through raw aerodynamic intuition. They weren't trying to be invisible, they were trying to be fast, but in their pursuit of the perfect wing, they stumbled upon the perfect ghost. For decades, historians argued that the stealth of the H229 was an accident or a myth. In 2008, the debate was finally settled. Engineers from Northrop Grumman, the company that built the B-2 Spirit, took the original German blueprints and built a $250,000 full-scale replica of the H229. They didn't just build it for a museum, they put it on a pole at their high-security testing range in the Mojave Desert and blasted it with World War II frequency radar. The results were terrifying. The test proved that an H-229 flying at its top speed of 600 miles per hour would have appeared on British radar only 8 minutes before it was directly over London. For comparison, a standard German bomber gave the British 20 to 30 minutes of warning. The H-229 glitch had effectively cut the world's most advanced defense system's reaction time by nearly 70%. The British fighters of the time, like the Spitfire, wouldn't have even had time to start their engines before the bombs were falling. But there was one final problem the Hortens couldn't fully solve: the heat. The H-229 was powered by the first generation of jet engines. These engines were notoriously unreliable and ran incredibly hot. This created a thermal signature that could be seen by the human eye and eventually by early infrared sensors. To hide the engines, the Hortens buried them deep inside the wing. They used specialized air intakes that shielded the spinning metal fan blades, another feature seen on modern stealth aircraft today. This wasn't just engineering, it was a desperate attempt to hide a predator in plain sight. They were fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Allied armies and one against the very laws of physics that wanted to reveal their position. The H-229 was a cheat code that arrived too late to be activated. By the time the third prototype was flying, the American Third Army was miles away from the factory. The blueprints were seized, the engineers were interrogated, and the Ghost was dismantled and shipped to the United States in pieces. But the science didn't die. It was merely reclassified. The charcoal skin, the blended wing, and the buried engines became the black projects of the Cold War. The Horten brothers hadn't just built a plane for Germany, they had written the Bible of invisibility that the rest of the world would spend the next 80 years.
In April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, a secret war began within the war. It was called Operation Paperclip. While the infantry was focused on territory, the intelligence agencies were focused on intellectual loot. They weren't looking for gold, they were looking for the glitch. When American troops reached the Gotthard Wagenfabrik factory, they found the Horten H-229 V3 prototype sitting in pieces. It was immediately labeled Top Secret and Priority 1. It wasn't just captured, it was kidnapped. Shipped across the Atlantic in a wooden crate, the ghost plane disappeared into the classified depths of the American military-industrial complex. For half a century, the official story was that the Horten H-229 was a failed experiment. It was placed in the back of a Smithsonian warehouse, gathering dust. But while the public was told the design was a dead end, engineers at Northrop and Lockheed were quietly visiting the facility. They were looking at the wing's curvature. They were measuring the bell-shaped lift. When the United States military began the Advanced Technology Bomber program in the 1970s, the program that would eventually create the B-2 Spirit, they faced a massive problem. How do you make a giant bomber invisible to Soviet radar? They tried every modern computer model available, and every single one pointed them back to the 1944 Horten blueprint. The tail had to go. The body had to be the wing. The ghost was being summoned once again. There is a legendary story in aviation history. Jack Northrop, the founder of Northrop Grumman, had spent his entire life trying to convince the U.S. Air Force that the flying wing was the future. He had built the YB-37 and YB-49 in the late 40s, but they were sabotaged by political infighting and technical instability. In 1980, months before he died, and long before the public knew about the B-2, the Air Force took a terminal Jack Northrop into a secure room. They showed him a scale model of the B-2 Spirit. He reportedly burst into tears and wrote on a piece of paper, "Now I know why God has kept me alive for the last 25 years." He was looking at the 21st century evolution of the Horten glitch.
The connection isn't just visual, it's mathematical. Both the Horten H229 and the B-2 Spirit use split flaps for steering because they lack a vertical rudder. Both use a W-shaped trailing edge to dissipate radar waves. And most importantly, both use the deep burial method. The U.S. military didn't just find a plane in 1945, they found a time machine. By studying the Horten H229, they skipped decades of trial and error. The B-2 Spirit costs billions of dollars per aircraft, yet its core philosophy, the removal of the tail to achieve invisibility, was solved by two brothers in a workshop with plywood and charcoal glue 50 years before the B-2 ever took flight. The Ghost plane wasn't a failure, it was the alpha version of the most expensive weapon system in human history.